Hey everyone, it's Miriam with a Y. I am super excited about this video. It's my first ever three-way challenge with two of my super talented, ultra creative YouTube buddies, Sharon Lindley of Vivid Days and Tammy Anderson. This time around, I'm the one who chose the theme for the challenge and the rules. I kept it simple. I chose bubbles as the theme, any kind of bubbles. And the only rules were that resin had to be used and the bubbles had to be created by us. No buying ready-made bubble-like things and putting them in resin unless you totally enhance them in some way. Now, I chose underwater bubbles for my piece. We had no idea what the others were doing, so the three of us are going to be just as surprised when we see each other's pieces as you guys. Now, I know they put a lot into their pieces. Mine is a pretty involved piece. It took several days to make and edit. Oh my gosh. But it's packed with tips and tricks, so don't miss a minute. And make sure to check out Tammy and Sharon's videos too. I know those two will delight you. I've added their links in my video description box below this video. Alrighty, let's do this. In keeping with the bubble idea, I decided to work on a round substrate. I picked a 12-inch wooden disc. These were sent to me by an amazing viewer and patron. Thank you ever so much, Victoria W. These were super sweet of you, and they are awesome. After tossing around a few ideas, I chose a pretty light color palette with occasional pops of brighter color later. So, my first step is to paint my disc. I have a bottle of craft paint, the perfect color for my background, so I proceeded to paint it. Sealing wood you'll use with resin is really important because unsealed wood is very porous, so it will release lots and lots of micro bubbles into your resin. Now, my theme may be bubbles, but not the unwanted type. Once this coat dries, I will give it a light sanding just to knock down the raised grain when you paint real wood. A lot of the grain wants to sort of peel up a little bit. So I will sand that down smooth, and then I will put another coat going in the opposite direction, so across the grain, and I'll let that dry. And then once again, one more coat going with the grain. And then hopefully then I can just call it sealed. We can only hope. For the base of my actual bubbles, I chose these little wood cutouts. This is a bag of 21 pieces in different sizes, and most of them are perfect for this piece. I probably won't use the largest sizes or these little tiny ones. You may need to sand a couple of the edges smooth. Now, just like my background, these need to be painted well and sealed. When you do this sort of thing, be generous with the paint. You're trying to create a good plastic barrier between the resin and all the tiny bubbles dying to escape the wood. Make sure to get the edges too. And sanding between coats will lead to a smoother surface, which may or may not be important for you, but I didn't want wood grain showing through on my bubbles. Here, the one on the right wasn't sanded yet, but the one on the left was. Okay, let's talk fun things to add to our piece. Now, something I've pulled out to make possible embellishments for this piece, I'm still on the fence about them, is my little Sizzix Sidekick. This is a small die cutting machine. It's super portable. I mean, it fits in one hand, and it'll cut small dies, wafer thin dies. And one of my favorite materials to cut is just the cardboard that you get from an old cereal box. It's a really good weight and has a good three-dimensional quality to it when cut. So I'm going to cut myself little pieces that can fit through this machine and cut out these dies. Now to cut these, if you've never used a die cutting machine, I have 2 plates and I'm going to make my sandwich. And I'm going to take one of the 2 plates. I keep one that I abuse and the other one I try to keep a little bit less abused. And so in other words, I cut onto this plate. So I put my cardboard down, take my die, and then put it cutting face down. So these lines are the cutting lines. So I make them face down onto the cardboard. Now ordinarily, if I was cutting standard paper, I'd be able to fit a couple of dies through at the same time. But I find that when I'm cutting through the cardboard, which is a little thicker than this machine really wants to cut, that I'm better off not asking for too much and just letting it just do one small piece at a time. So I'm just gonna run this one piece through for now. Get it lined up and use the crank to feed it through the machine. Now, because it's cardboard again, ordinarily one pass should be enough, but since it's cardboard, I'm going to run it backwards also, just to make sure that it's cut all the way through. It may do it on one pass, but I don't want to mess around. I want a good cut right away. And now I will just separate this from the background. It can be a little tricky. Again, this is much easier if it's just paper, but because it's cardboard, it's a little trickier. And there you go. And now I have a really pretty piece of coral, and all I have to do now is paint that whatever color I want. So I will do that with my other pieces. And again, I may or may not use them all, but at least I'll have the option of things to play around with. And then sometimes you have little pieces, like little extra pieces to push out. And what's nice about this one is that it has like a little bit of an embossed texture. That's really nice. I'm not going to let the rest of the cardboard go to waste. So I have a little piece that I want to cut. So I will put it there. And then this cuts out little fish. Again, I don't know that I'll use them, but I want the option. And these I'll leave on the cardboard for now until I paint them, because I think that'll be easier than to try to pop them out and to paint these little itty bitty things, because they're kind of tiny. I've pulled out a series of metallics to kind of paint my coral and leaves, just so they have a little bit of pop in the piece. So these are all deco art paints. And then I've got a couple of Lumiere paints. These are metallics also. They're made by Jacquard, the same people who make Pinata alcohol ink. So I'm just gonna kind of make myself an assortment of coral and greenery that I can play around with. Since I'm not sure exactly what colors I want, I figured I'll make a couple of different colors, and that way I can mix and match. When doing this, I want to make sure that I paint inside the sort of openings so that the sides get painted too, because they might show. So I'm just slathering on a lot of paint so that I can get the sides painted. So by swirling it around, I'm kind of assuring that it gets into all the little nooks and crannies. And then when a piece is done, I'll just lift it up and move it over to the drying area. And I'll check before I do that. I'm just picking up some color out of the cap. A piece doesn't have to be a uniform color. This is nature, and nature is never perfect. It's just perfectly beautiful. Oh my gosh, how sappy was that? Oh my gosh, that was so sappy, but I believe it. There. And this way now I have this little kind of half gold, half red piece, and I think that's pretty cool. And what I made sure to do too was to cut in both directions. So when I put the cardboard in, sometimes I would put it into the cutter the paper side up and sometimes the paper side down, but I'm only ever going to paint on the paper side. But having cut it both ways, I have pieces that face both ways. So like this piece and this piece are mirror images of each other. So that way I have, again, more options. And now I have a good selection of pieces of coral in different colors and little pieces of greenery. And I have quite a few fish. These are just a sampling of the colors that I have made up, so that if I want to use any of these, I have a decent selection to pick from. When I go to start applying my layers of resin, I have a couple of different options. I can let each layer drip over the side of this piece and sort of build up sort of a dome because of that, because as each layer drips off the edge, it would sort of round off. But that can get a little tricky as, you know, more and more resin pours off the side, and I never love that because you're wasting resin too. Another option I have is to put tape all the way around and create a dam to hold the resin in. But I kind of want a frame around this. But this is a round flat disc, no frame. So what I did was order a 12-inch embroidery hoop. I've already removed the screw. And an embroidery hoop is two parts. This part out here and the inner ring. So this is a 12-inch ring. And the inner ring fits really beautifully for this disc. So what I'm going to do now is glue this onto this disc. I've already gone ahead and painted the inside the same color. I don't yet know what I want to do with the outside, so I've left that the natural color for now while I decide. But for now, the inside definitely needed to be painted. What I'm going to do now is sort of flip this around because the ring is just a hair bigger than the disc. So I have to sort of position the disc just so, make it sort of evenly spaced all the way around and sort of glue it down that way. So what I'm going to do now is mix myself up some 2-part epoxy, quick setting epoxy. And affix this to my ring. And for that, I'm just using one of these sort of syringe style quick setting epoxies. And just like the resin that we'll be using later, you mix this until it's a uniform blend too. So now I'm just going to spread a nice even, hopefully, layer all the way around. And with the glue all spread, I'm going to now set my disc down and sort of slide it into position. I'm going to put binder clips to hold this in place. And that's done, and I have a good flush press between the frame and the background. So I know that when I pour resin in here, I won't have to worry about any leaks. And what I'm going to do now is, before the glue has a chance to really set and become hard, is just sort of scrape out any overspill. And I'll do that all the way around and touch up any scratch marks with paint. And then on the other side, like I said, this is a little smaller than the frame. So I've got a little bit of a gap, but when this hangs, you won't see that. And just sand this down to make the transition less severe if it's an issue for you. Now let's start designing our world. I'm starting out by painting somewhat of a reef-like thing and some coral in a bluish gray color. And I'm making the coral much smaller than the pieces I die cut earlier. This is to suggest that this reef is, like out in the distance. On the other side, I'll paint a similar reef, but a little bigger. And I'll throw in a little more detail on this side. So, in theory, this reef-like thing is less out in the distance. My hope is to give this piece a sense of depth, to suggest a wide open space. I'm keeping the colors subtle and similar to the background so that it doesn't compete with any embellishments I might add, like the cutout coral pieces I painted earlier, and the fish, and maybe a little surprise that I'll throw in later. Those will all be more for the foreground. Now for a bit of seaweed. This is fun for me because if you know me, you know that this is just like painting my beloved tendrils. So I'm a happy camper doing this. I've thinned this paint a bit with Floetrol to make it a bit more translucent, like actual seaweed would be. Now, I'm not going for realism in this piece. You'll definitely see that later. I just like that you can see through one piece of seaweed to a piece behind it. Now, you can thin your paint with water or pouring medium or like clear gloss varnish even, just to get it to be a little bit more translucent when you're painting. Okay, now for some fun 3D things. I'm going to want to add some sand at the bottom of my piece. Now this first step of spreading two-part epoxy where I'll want my sand later is completely optional. I'm just doing this to make my life easier in a bit, and that'll all make sense in a little bit. Now with glue down, this is a good time for me to add a piece of driftwood and a shell, why not? The rest of the glue is for a preliminary thin layer of sand. Again, this is totally optional. I'm actually going to want to spread a thick mixture of sand mixed with white glue, but I find that it's not as easy to spread as I'd like when I do it on a smooth surface like this wooden board is. So this thin layer, once it's dry, will actually give my surface like tooth, a bit of tooth. So when I go to spread my thick sand mix, it'll come off the stick onto the background very easily. Before I go on to my sand, I'll add a 3D piece of greenery. I'll tuck it in behind the driftwood, which is there to be functional as well as ornamental. And now for my sand. I'm going to mix up a generous amount of white glue. This is just Elmer's glue. Any PVA glue will do. And a good amount of sand. And then I'll make a paste out of it. And then I can spread it where I want it. You'll see that when you weren't looking, I added another shell. One of the things I'm doing when I add a shell is filling in the hollow part of the shell, like the back of the shell, or in this case, the inside of this shell, with hot glue, so that there are no pockets for air bubbles later when I go to add my resin. Another tiny bit of driftwood. And how about a little bit of coral next? Just a couple of pieces. A little bit of hot glue for that too. And we are good. With the sand all down and drying, I'm going to put in my biggest, most up-close reef ledge-like structure. I'm kind of making this up as I go along, kind of based on pictures I've seen and probably one too many Discovery Channel marathons. But it's still mostly made up too. I kind of like making up life forms and worlds. It's kind of part of my embrace the abstract philosophy. It lets me have fun without getting too stressed out about simply creating something pretty. Now, after painting the dark, shadowy area, I'm kind of thinking it's too dark for this piece, so instead of painting over it in a lighter color, I'm going to add lots of dots in a lighter color. I'm doing that with a dotting stylus that has two different size tips. Adding the dots both lightens this dark area, and it also gives it a fun texture that's a little coral-like. So I'm happy with this. With that done, I added a bit more greenery and sand, and now I'm adding a bit of coral peeking in from outside the frame, so to speak. Since this piece won't get strategically hidden by something like sand or a piece of driftwood, the glue gun is too thick. So I'm using a couple of drops of crazy glue to keep this piece of coral in place. Off camera, I added a couple more pieces on the right side as well, and a couple of fish for fun. Also, all of these were put down with just crazy glue. Now I think it's ready for our first layer of resin. But before I can do that, I have to make sure that any loose sand is entirely out of the piece, so it doesn't float around in the resin, because I promise you it absolutely would end up exactly where I wouldn't want it. That would be Murphy's Law of Resin. Now, with that cleanup finished, I am ready to pour some resin. I always love this part. It is totally satisfying every single time to see things get covered with this shiny liquid. Ah, I love it. Now I'm coaxing it into spots that are tricky, and I'm trying to lure unwanted bubbles out into the open where I can blast them with a heat gun. Some more resin and more bubble checking. Always look along your edges. The sneaky little buggers love to hide out there. Now, something I'm noticing is that one or more of my paints is bleeding into the resin and giving it a greenish tint. Now, initially I was bummed out about this, but then I decided to go with it and see it as a happy accident. Thank you, Bob Ross. I decided that parts of the ocean look green all the time. So that's what's happening here. Yeah, it was a plan. Yeah. No, it wasn't a plan, but I'm going with it. It also got me to make another design decision later, which I ended up loving. More on that later. Okay, I'm going to put this piece to bed for the night and move on to working on my little wooden bubble cutouts. Given the variation in my ocean color due to the bleeding green, I decided to paint my bubbles different colors now too. Here you see that I've started adding highlights and shadows, as well as a few things that would be visible if you were looking through a bubble. So like if there's a bubble in front of a plant, you would see the plant through the bubble. So I'm kind of adding that to a couple of them. The easiest way that I found to put in my fading shadow line at the bottom of each of these discs was with a regular good old number 2 pencil. I literally draw a thick line along the bottom edge of each disc and then used a finger to smooth it out and give it a soft, blurry fade toward the center of the disc. It's so easy to do and it's super effective. Since that worked so well, I try my chalk pencil for the highlights, and it's perfect for the job. So off I go making a bunch of these. This worked well because my discs were painted with paint that dries with a matte finish. That finish accepts the chalk better than semi-gloss, for example, would, or gloss. Gloss I don't think would take the chalk at all. Now, what I'm going to do now is top coat each of these with a clear layer of resin so that when I go to add them to the piece, they already have started to build up a little bit of a dome. Now our bubbles have their top coat, and I'm working out the placement for each one. I've gone ahead and attached a couple, but I've got several more to go. I'm using a glue gun specifically for this task because I want to build a little supporting mound to elevate each one. A couple of them show little things behind them, like a leaf or a piece of seaweed, so I have to line those up just so. But before I continue, I want to bring out a little whimsical piece that I'm adding to this scene. I die cut a mermaid, and I had fun painting her in all metallic colors. I gave her tail a purple to aqua ombre look. I gave her fiery copper hair and champagne gold skin. I think she'll look sweet leaning on this little edge here. Now, since I want her tail fin to be behind a bubble so that you can sort of see it through the bubble, so to speak, I'm putting her down with crazy glue and not raising her off the surface too much. But I did give the body of her tail a curvy wave, and I lifted her head up off the surface a little bit. With her in place, I add the bubble on which I painted a copy of her fin to complete the see-through illusion of these bubbles. And then I put down the rest of our painted discs. For a couple of them, I elevated them even more by not just adding a mound of glue, but a little round wooden disc too. You can also use like a penny for something like this. I'm hoping that this will enhance the 3D appearance by making each one of these like different heights. And then for a little sparkle, because sparkle is always good, I'm coating these with a super thin layer of glamour dust. It'll dry clear and sparkle a lot under the next coat of resin. And now let's put that resin layer in. I need it to be thick, but not so thick that it covers up any of my little wooden discs. I do give them each a domed top coat though, and I let the resin drip over the sides. I'm hoping this enhances the bubbly look. At least that's been the plan in my head all along, so it's gotta work. It's just gotta work. All right, I make sure that resin flows under every disc, under the fairy, behind the coral. I torch any micro bubbles I see so far, and then I check for any hidden air pockets. I add some last bits of resin and torch again. Now, once that's done, I could put this beauty to sleep, but I decide, oh heck, let's add a teeny bit more blingage. Yeah, that's a word. No, really, honestly, that's a word. See, look. I'll throw in a few more crystals, just a few, and then I'll really put this to bed. No, really, honest. So this awesome piece is done, and I love it. Oh my gosh, I can't tell you how much I love it. It makes me smile so much. It was a complete labor of love, and it taught me so much. I forgot to mention that I had painted the frame champagne gold before the first coat of resin, so that, you know, it would kind of coordinate with the rest of the piece. I think it's also a really pretty neutral color. The 3D nature of this piece worked just like I'd hoped. The bubbles are all different heights. The little crystals pop out too, as does the mermaid's main tail and some of the coral at the bottom. I love the variety of the colors and the green cast of the water at the bottom. I've actually come to like it. I am a happy resin camper. What do you think of it? I am dying to hear your thoughts. I am super duper excited to see what Sharon and Tammy made too. I hope you all are also. Tell me what you thought of this in the comments. Would you like to see us do more challenges in the future? Did you learn any tricks from this? Get any ideas? If you found this useful or fun, leave a thumbs up and consider becoming a patron to make more involved pieces like this one possible. If the die cutting part interested you, there are 3 detailed videos about it for reward patrons on Patreon. including unboxing the machine, checking out a bunch of dyes, and fun ways to use them. Thank you all for watching. If you'd be so kind as to share this video with your friends and social media groups, that would be amazing. Thank you to all of you who help the channel in any way you can. Let your bubbly, creative nature shine. See you soon. Bye now.